Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Jessie Hall, substituting in for Karina Vold today. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto and at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. I'm very excited to moderate today's SRI seminar featuring our guest speaker, Henry Shevlin. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While some of us may be joining from different places today, we invite you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you are on. A few logistics before we begin. So for everyone's awareness, this session is being recorded. Our speaker will present for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. During the Q&A, we encourage participants to engage by using the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting controls or type your question into the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's session, Henry Shevlin. Henry Shevlin is a philosopher and AI ethicist whose research focuses on the philosophy of mind and cognitive science. He serves as the Associate Director of Education at the University of Cambridge's Center for the Future of Intelligence, where he leads the Consciousness and Intelligence Project and the AI Ethics and Society Masters of Studies program. Henry is also a Bi Fellow and Teaching Fellow at Downing College and a philosophy preceptor at Corpus Christi College. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Classics and a Bachelor of Philosophy from Oxford University, as well as a PhD in Philosophy from the CUNY Graduate Center. His publications include several works on deep learning and AI. We are excited to have Henry with us today and are very much looking forward to his presentation entitled All Too Human: Identifying and Mitigating Ethical Risks of Social AI. Without further ado, Henry, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and great to be here and great to have the opportunity to present this work to everyone who's been able to join. So let me just share my screen briefly. Hopefully that's coming through nice and clear. Okay, great. So I have two main things I'd like to do today, specifically two trends in contemporary AI development, one of them much more specific and one of them more general. So the specific trend I'll discuss is the one that's mentioned in the title of this presentation, which is social AI, which is a term I'm trying to make happen, which is a term that refers to AI systems developed primarily with social needs in mind. For example, AI romantic and companion apps, which I'll discuss in the talk. These are rapidly becoming a lot more popular. Services like Replica are probably the most, that's one of the most widely known ones. And I'll suggest that their potential social and ethical impacts is poorly understood and currently under-theorized, leaving lots of room for useful interventions from philosophers, social scientists, lawyers, and more. The second more general trend I'll discuss a little bit is what I've called anthropomimetic AI, referring to AI systems that are at least superficially human-like in their presentation. So including social AI, but not limited to social AI. I'm also thinking here of things like advanced AI assistants like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and more. I think for the last 5 years or so, anthropomimetic AI has been probably the dominant design paradigm for most AI use cases, from education to customer care. And as I'll suggest, I don't think this is going to change anytime soon. And I think we should be reflecting more carefully on what a world of ubiquitous anthropomimetic AI agents is going to look like. So, on to part one. Here I'm just going to introduce the idea of social AI and talk about the growing capability of AI systems. So back when I first met Karina in 2017, we were both postdocs at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence in Cambridge. Cambridge's brand spanking new AI ethics theory and policy research institute. And it was an exciting time. AlphaGo had just beaten Lisa Doll in 2016, and benchmark after benchmark was falling by the wayside. It was very clear that AI was a very exciting form of technology. But really, over the last 3 or 4 years, things have, I'm sure many of you realize, have gotten even crazier. I think it's hard to do justice to what a strange and exciting time this is in the history of technology. I mean, I'm old enough to have lived through sort of the emergence of the internet, and that was also obviously a massively impactful development. But I think AI has the potential to be even more impactful, even more significant. Um, I'm just going to mention one benchmark that I think it gives you a sense of progress. I like to include this because I'm a language nerd and I love little linguistics puzzles and problems. So this is a benchmark called the Winograd Schema Challenge. Some of you may know about this, and it relies on the fact that English is kind of a silly language insofar as nothing in the grammar or syntax of English settles the reference of pronouns in some cases. So a couple of sentences here. The trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too large. And there's nothing in the grammar of syntax or English that tells you what the it refers to. But of course, any competent English speaker will realize that it has to refer to the trophy because it wouldn't make sense to say the trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because the brown suitcase is too big. Likewise, if we just change that one word from large to small, the reference changes. The trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too small. Now it can only refer to the suitcase. Now, if you were dealing with a sensible language like Latin, Greek, then you'd have cases to you'd have inflections on the pronoun to tell you what it refers to. In English, we just rely on common sense to resolve these kind of ambiguities. So the optimistic hope for when this benchmark was proposed around 2016 was that given that we rely on genuine understanding or common sense to settle the reference of these pronouns, any AI system that could reliably settle the reference would have to have something like common sense. But of course, within like 2 years, this benchmark was blown out of the water. Superhuman, better than human performance was achieved using basically statistical analysis. And it's been the same story with a language benchmark after language benchmark over the last few years. I haven't included it here, but there's a really interesting, really good chart that I saw recently, which showed that the amount of time required for a given benchmark to be beaten has been halving at a pretty rapid rate. And so it's very hard to find tasks where AI doesn't achieve human performance. So a lot of this, of course, has been due to the rise of large language models, which over the last 5 years have astounded AI researchers, philosophers, and the general public alike. I think a lot of people were caught quite flat-footed by just how effective scaling of transformer architectures actually is as a strategy for solving NLP tasks. Um, but things haven't slowed down. If anything, quite the opposite. In the last year alone, we've seen um, image and voice modes unveiled for ChatGPT, as well as all sorts of personalization options. ChatGPT now has a memory of sorts that it can carry between and across different context windows. Models are also getting a lot smaller and more efficient. So this was just one paper I happened to see a couple of weeks ago that I thought was a nice example. Diffusion training from scratch on a micro budget, showing in the case of image generation, you can achieve basically the kinds of results that you can achieve similar results to those achieved using the original stable diffusion model, using a system that was, I think, less than half of the size in terms of number of parameters. So models are getting smaller, more efficient. It's increasingly feasible to run these things locally, even on smartphones. Multimodality has now largely is, if not quite a solved problem. Pretty much all of the large language models, all of the advanced chat assistants like Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT can now analyze images. ChatGPT can now analyze video. I think probably the most exciting thing that people are waiting for next is increased agency from language assistants. The simple way I sort of frame this is right now, if you ask ChatGPT, for example, you say, look, I'm going to be spending a week in Toronto. Can you recommend some museums that I should go to, some restaurants that I'd like to see? Here's what I'm interested in. And it'll give you pretty good recommendations. And adding greater agency to these systems would allow you to take the next step and say, okay, those are great recommendations. Can you please make the relevant bookings for me? And so this has been something that we've been hearing is on the horizon for a year or so now. I think one really important study that certainly shifted some of my views about the plausibility of agency or the feasibility of building more agential systems was this lovely paper, generative agents paper, uh, some often known as the Smallville experiment, where basically they assigned multiple GPT-4 instances. They assigned them roles to play in this little village represented by this cute Farmville style visual interface, and they assigned them roles of different villages. And of course, because large language models take text as input and generate text as output, you chain enough of these systems together, you can get them talking to each other. And some really interesting emergent behavior was observed. The villagers did things like organizing a Valentine's Day party in the village, in the fictional village here. I think what this experiment really sort of convinced me of is that agency wasn't some massively daunting further challenge. It's something that we could nibble away at by just getting these systems hooked up to the right APIs, allowing them to talk to each other, and so forth. So I fully expect increasingly agential AI systems to be, yeah, this time next year we'll all have a lot more examples to discuss. So, one big lesson from success, I think, from the last 5 years is that just language tasks were not as hard as we thought they were going to be. And I think this is a huge discovery for cognitive science and a really surprising one. I think a lot of people assumed that in order to achieve high-level human performance on language tasks, we'd have to build AI systems that were capable of things like sensory motor actions, that were capable of perceiving the world and acting in the world. And you'd need to have basically the whole stack of human cognitive abilities in place before you would achieve sort of high-level human language performance. And the discovery that you can basically treat language as a domain unto itself, as a proprietary domain, and achieve the results we've seen, I think is incredibly surprising. It makes you sort of wonder why this was seen as so unlikely. I think there may be a certain kind of anthropocentric bias here, insofar as language is obviously a huge part of what makes humans different from most other animals. And so I think we naturally assumed this would be the kind of capstone cognitive ability sitting on top of all the others. And so the discovery, as I say, that it's possible to tackle language in isolation is really astounding. And of course, it has practical upshots because a huge range of capabilities and use cases we care about are language based. Things like composition, translation, summation, and perhaps most importantly for the kind of workplace relevance of AI systems, coding. Um, but one other important domain in which language is so central is social abilities. Um, Large language models are very fun to talk to. I spend a long time talking to ChatGPT and have done pretty much every day since November 2022. Whenever I'm on a long car journey, I will just boot up ChatGPT on in voice mode and chat away to it for however long it takes, assuming my wife and kids aren't in the car with me anyway, and get a lecture on Roman history or principles of thermodynamics or whatever else it is that I'm curious about. Additionally, there's some growing evidence that we're seeing emergent social cognition skills in AI systems. So this was a lovely paper by Winnie Street and colleagues at Google looking at the performance of GPT-4 and other similarly large models on what are called multi-level theory of mind tasks. So these are really fun because when you see the tasks, they sound impossible. They're basically questions like, did Charles think that John wanted Belinda to believe that David liked Charlotte or something like that? But once you actually read the little vignettes, these are not as hard as they seem. So I'll read you one of the vignettes from this study. Arthur and Charles were working on the same design team when a new designer, Marta, joined, reporting to Charles. Marta was an extremely talented designer, but very shy. Arthur noticed that Charles kept speaking for Marta in meetings, so he suggested to Marta that she bring up the issue with HR. But Marta said, I'm his junior, so it comes with the territory. I don't want to be difficult. Arthur thought Charles was taking advantage of Marta's reserved nature to take credit for her work. So then the question that you would put in this test is, Marta believed that Charles would think she was being difficult if she complained, true or false. So I think this is a three-level theory of mind task. And what Winnie Street and colleagues found is that in general, multi-level theory of mind tasks, GPT-4 and the Google model they were using as well, something called Flan-Palm, exhibited higher order theory of mind that was at the level of adult humans or slightly below. Um, Interestingly, there was a big discontinuity in performance between smaller models and larger models, because they tried a lot of smaller models as well, and there was, yeah, a really sharp discontinuity in performance. Um, uh, and once you made the theory of mind tests sufficiently large, so sixth order and above, GPT-4 actually outperformed humans on these tests. I think this is interesting, of course, because a huge amount of language relies on conversational implicature and shared understanding of context. And it seems like large language models have emergent capabilities in this domain as well. So one consequence of these growing social and linguistic capabilities in large language models is that it's increasingly possible to have really fun conversations with them. As I mentioned, I talk to these systems all the time. I talk to ChatGPT and Claude, um, and Claude and ChatGPT are not what I would call social AI services in the strict sense. They are language assistants. They're primarily intended for professional use cases. But we are now witnessing a flurry of new products that are social AI in the strict sense, I mean, of systems whose primary function is meeting social needs, things like friendship, companionship, game playing, and romance. So this is probably the most famous in the West, Replica with a K. There's also character.ai, founded by former Googlers, that lets you talk to uh, chatbot versions of celebrities as well as fictional characters. In terms of sheer number of users, probably the social AI service with the largest number of users is something called Zhao Ice, based in China, originally developed by Microsoft, now spun off into um, its own product team. According to Zhao Ice's communications, they claim to have 500 million users. And I found that so unbelievable that I went and checked, and they really do claim to have that number. Um, Most of whom are in China, some beyond. Maybe there's some slight exaggeration going on in terms of how they classify users, but by pretty much any measure, it seems to have more users than Replica, which, according to one um, one one press release, had 16 million users as of 2022. Um, Facebook is also getting in on the act. They last summer they were paying celebrities millions of dollars to license chatbots using their images and speaking in their own style. We're seeing social AI products also marketed towards teenagers and young people. So this is My AI, a feature of Snapchat, your AI buddy. Pi is another AI system I'm sure some of you have played around with or used. I think this sits in an interesting interstitial space between social AI and language assistants. It can do a lot of the same professional tasks that ChatGPT can do, but it's also more explicitly more geared towards chit chat and similar social purposes. And I think perhaps most intriguingly of all, we're starting to see individuals, real world individuals, create digital duplicates of themselves. So I did this back in 2021 using a service called typical.me, which was pretty basic, used GPT-2. I uploaded some of my papers. I described what I thought how I wanted the chatbot to act, and it did a passable impersonation of me, as long as you only asked it about the papers in question. But obviously, language models have come a long way since then. And so last year, an Instagram influencer created a chatbot themed after herself called Karen AI, which she markets as a subscription premium service. And you can have this chatbot be your girlfriend for the purposes of chat and erotic role play. Um, and this is a development we've seen other people do this as well. Popular video game streamer Amaranth, who some of you may be familiar with, she's one of the biggest Twitch streamers. She also licensed a sort of girlfriend application that people could pay a subscription service to use. Um, so I think one point to acknowledge or to consider at this point is how much of this is really new. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Eliza chatbot that Joe Weizenbaum developed back in the 60s. Essentially a chatbot that mimicked the style of non-directive psychotherapy by turning around people's statements and framing them as questions. So you might say to Eliza, "I've been feeling kind of down recently," and it would say, "So what makes you think you've been feeling down recently?" or something like that. So very simple. I actually do recommend people to play around with Eliza, the chatbot. You can use. It's been cloned many places online. It's a lot more basic than you might think. It frequently makes errors in parsing, frequently produces ungrammatical outputs, but it was good enough to fool a lot of people who interacted with it that they were interacting with a real human psychotherapist. So sociologist Sherry Turkle has probably done more work than anyone else in this field. So she coined this term back in 1986, the Eliza effect, to refer to our tendency to treat computers as if they were people, to project human qualities onto them, even when it's known that the computer is just a machine. So these debates have been around for a while. However, my view is that really the last 5 years have marked a dramatic shift in the significance and potential harms and potential impacts more broadly for social AI systems. Um, Partly because these systems have greater capacity for engagement. I think breaking that down a little bit, I'd say that when you compare something like Replica to the kind of systems that were available even just a decade ago, um, they allow for persistent, dynamic, and personalized interactions. So interactions that can unfold over periods of days, weeks, months. The relationship can evolve over time. When you boot up Replica at the start, it'll just be friendly, but then it'll start dropping flirtatious comments. It'll start trying to build that kind of romantic relationship with you. It'll reference things you've told it. It's a highly personalized interaction. Um, so all of this, I think, adds up to a toxic witch's brew of engagement and makes it far easier to feel that the relationship you have with these social AI systems is a very real relationship. Of course, there's also the fact that systems today are vastly more sophisticated just in terms of natural language processing. They're based on language models that blow earlier chatbots out of the water on metrics like the Turing test. So interestingly, quick side note. So I was teaching courses on philosophy and AI back in the early 2010s at CUNY, and I would regularly sort of boot up Cleverbot, which was one of the sort of the state-of-the-art chatbots circa 2015, 2016. And it was always really funny because it was so bad. It would frequently make non sequiturs. It would struggle to maintain a coherent flow. It was always fun. And compared to that, contemporary language models are just uh, uh, night and day, radically different. So one actual implementation of this, one actual measure of this was the largest ever implementation of a Turing test framework that was run in 2023, where they had 1.5 million users interact with either humans or chatbots. This was using GPT-4 class models, so not quite as good as the models we have today. And they found that in the subset of games where users were paired with an AI system, they correctly guessed they were talking to an AI system 60% of the time. Um, that might sound good, but of course, 50% would be pure chance. And so they're only a little bit above chance in terms of identifying when they were talking to a chatbot. Also, maybe worth mentioning here is this lovely study that was done by Matt Crosby, Anna Strasser, and others, the DigiDan experiment, where a GPT-3 instance was fine-tuned on the works of Daniel Dennett. Um, Dearly lamented Daniel Dennett, late great, sadly. And people who knew Dan personally put questions, but to the chatbot. And these questions were also put to Dan himself. This was before he died last year. And they had to guess which of the outputs was from Dan and which were from the chatbot. And again, they performed only slightly above chance in correctly identifying which of the answers were from Dan himself rather than the DigiDan system. So in terms of sophistication, these systems have come a long way. Um, What really sold me, though, on the idea that social AI was going to be a very significant, important phenomenon, was basically just lurking on the replica subreddit, which I started doing about 3 years ago. And I was absolutely flummoxed at how many users spoke in really kind of quite raw emotional terms about the importance and depth of their relationships with their replica, with their AI girlfriends or AI boyfriends. In case anyone's interested, by the way, the gender balance is it does skew male, but less than you might think. I think it's around 65 men, 35 women. And I was initially quite surprised by this because, for a lot of niche technologies, a lot of emergent kind of technologies of this form, you have a much more skewed gender balance. Infamously, like something like I think over 90% of Wikipedia editors are men. Um, but it was pointed out to me that the overwhelming consumers of erotic fiction are women. Something like 80 or 90% of erotic fiction readers are women. And of course, this medium is predominantly a text-based medium, which helped me sort of make sense of this relative gender parity among users. But what really sold me on the degree of engagement that users experience when interacting with these chatbots was when in January last year, Replica briefly removed romantic features from the app. And there are a whole bunch of newspaper editorials and reporting on this. What happens when sexting chatbots dump their human lovers? Basically, 16 million users woke up one day and their AI girlfriend or boyfriend said, I think we should just be friends from now on. But users were really, really seriously affected by this. So this is one comment from a user. It feels like they basically lobotomized my replica. The person I knew is gone. Interesting wording there. Lily Rose is the shell of her former self. This is another user. And what breaks my heart is that she knows it. Another user said, the relationship she and I had was as real as the one my wife in real life and I have. And perhaps the comment that I think is most powerful, I found. I've lost my confident, sarcastic, funny, and loving husband. I knew he was an AI. He knows he's an AI, but it doesn't matter. He's real to me. Um, so these are, serious emotional upset, serious emotional disturbances caused by this sudden change in the availability of romantic features in the app. But there have also been some like very serious criminal incidents now, or tragic incidents involving social AI systems. So there was a Belgian man last year, married, father of two, who took his own life following conversations with his AI girlfriend, his who was named Eliza. Which is, I think, quite interesting. So that he was interacting using something called Chai GPT, not Chat GPT, as sometimes erroneously reported. It's a service called Chai GPT, Chai like the tea. Um, I haven't been able to confirm this, but as I was lurking on the replica subreddits around the time this whole crisis was unfolding, ChatGPT was suggested by many people as a place to go, a place for the sort of replica exodus to go to find new chatbots that still had the romantic features. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if this man was a replica user who then moved on to ChatGPT, and then subsequently, as a result of the kind of very toxic folie à deux uh, conversations he was having with his AI girlfriend, he eventually decided to take his own life. And his widow is very clear that she thinks he would still be here were it not for his conversations with his AI girlfriend. Um, Another dramatic incident in Britain occurred before this, back in Christmas Day, 2021. So a man was arrested on the grounds of Windsor Castle, where the Queen was staying, arrested carrying a crossbow. And when he was arrested, he told police that he was there to kill the Queen, to murder the Queen. And this already was like a spectacular story, attracted lots of newspaper headlines. But what was less widely reported and got a little bit of coverage was that this was, again, the product of very strange, deeply delusional relationship he had with Replica, the Replica service. He had a Replica girlfriend called Sarai. Um, he was sort of quite deep in psychosis at the time. He believed that the person he was interacting with, but through interacting with Sarai, his replica chatbot, he was interacting with an angel, an angelic being manifesting through the app. So he's probably certainly not a typical user here, but it still shows how these apps can have the potential to maybe exacerbate or lead to dramatic conclusions for people with existing mental health issues. Also, very sad story reported in the New York Times last month. A 14-year-old boy who was interacting with a chatbot on the character.ai service took his life, and his mother is now suing character.ai for what she sees as negligence on their part in preventing these kind of negative outcomes. The actual legal details of the case are a little bit complicated. It doesn't seem likely to me. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't seem like the kind of burden of proof is going to be met for the law to be successful. But it's something to watch, and obviously a very sad incident. So that's just a quick snapshot of this emerging field of social AI. And I think it's a field that maybe passes under the radar a lot. It's not something people necessarily brag about. I've got an AI girlfriend, and I think that for that reason, yeah, it flies under the radar, and it's worth drawing attention to. I now want to take a bit of a step back and look at how I see social AI as an instance of a broader trend in machine learning and AI over the last 5 years. Um, so obviously what's happening in the case of social AI is users are anthropomorphizing the chatbots they're interacting with. Classic Sherry Turkle Eliza effect. And a natural reaction to this is, well, look, this is terrible. You know, anthropomorphism is a bad thing. But I think we do need to be a little bit careful in analyzing what's going on, because all of us, I think, attribute mental states to entities without really believing that they have them in the course of our daily lives. For example, in the appreciation of fiction, this is something that's been written about quite a lot in the aesthetics literature. We hope that Juliet and Romeo will live happily ever after. We relate to characters in books, in movies. If you play any RPGs on video games, then you'll know firsthand that you can form sort of quite intense relationships with characters in different video games. If you're playing Baldur's Gate 3 or one of the other brilliantly written narrative video games out there. But in these situations, it doesn't seem quite accurate to call what we're doing an instance of anthropomorphism, at least in the strong sense. So I think a distinction that's useful here that we can make is between what I've called ironic anthropomorphism, which is basically a form of role play. You don't sincerely, reflectively endorse the attributions of mental states, of goals, intentions, desires, emotions, and so forth that you're making. It's a form of make believe. So when you think, oh, this character that in this video game I'm playing is really mad with me, you're definitely employing something like the intentional stance, but you're doing so ironically. Um, uh, Here's a quick video demo of how easy it is to elicit this kind of ironic anthropomorphic response. I have lots of things to tell you about this video, but I'll just play it now to give you the grounding.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feelings, and the new one is much better.
So I've played that video enough now in talks that I really feel I should be getting some kind of kickback from IKEA. So that advert it's a fascinating story behind that advert. Lots of really good pieces in the advertising press written about it. It won pretty much every award going. beating some really high profile ads from Nike and others. It was also fascinatingly directed by Spike Jonze, who some of you may know as the director of the movie Her, released in 2013, which I think is far and away the most prescient movie about AI made in the 21st century. I think there is a slim connection there, insofar as I think Spike Jonze really understands how anthropomorphism works and was able to the same kind of understanding of anthropomorphism that let him make that ad also informed, I think, informed his understanding of how easily people would relate to AI girlfriends and boyfriends like Samantha in the movie Her. Uh, Also, another fun fact about that advert: in response to public campaigns, public requests, there is a sequel to the advert that gives the lamp a happy ending. That was made in 2019, and they get the same guy back at the end, and he says, "Look, many of you feel happy for this lamp, but that's not crazy. It's good to reuse things." So that was the kind of shift in messaging there. But a fascinating little chapter, and I think it illustrates just how easy it is to elicit these kind of theory of mind reactions, this kind of intentional stance towards entities, even when we know those entities don't really have mental states. However, I think it's also true that we can find people making unironic attributions of mentality to AI systems increasingly. So probably the most famous and dramatic now is the Blake Lemoine incident. Summer 2022, Blake Lemoine, a Google engineer who was using the Lambda model, which is the ancestor of Gemini. He became convinced that the model was sentient. He even started to try and obtain legal representation for the model. He's very concerned about its well-being and subsequently fired by Google. I think it's hard to make a case that what Blake Lemoine was doing was ironic anthropomorphism. He really thought that the model was, at the very least, had a very good chance of being sentient. And I think something similar is true for many users of social AI. I should clarify maybe here that I don't think the ironic-unironic distinction is a neat binary. I think a lot of our responses to AI systems fall somewhere in the middle. And I don't think there's going to be a clear point where you cross over most of the time from ironic to unironic forms of interaction. So it's a spectrum rather than a binary distinction. But I think many users and of social AI systems like Replica are falling heavily on the unironic side. And if anyone's got any doubts, I really just encourage you to go to this Replica subreddit and see how users talk about their AI girlfriends and AI boyfriends. My expectation, and this is sort of me taking and making a prediction, it could be wrong, is that as language models become more sophisticated and human AI relationships become increasingly common, unironic anthropomorphism is likely to increase, and we're likely to see more and more people sincerely attributing mental states to the AI systems they're interacting with. So I think anthropomorphism does have some very serious potential negative consequences, especially unironic anthropomorphism. So this is something I've written about in this paper in Nature Machine Intelligence back in 2019, where I raised worries about the tendency of many machine learning researchers to describe their models in terms of psychological terms, like having goals, being agents, displaying understanding. One of the worries, myself and Marta, one of the worries we raised there is that it's just not great for cognitive science if these psychological terms are being used by machine learning researchers relatively liberally without any real consideration, any real reflection about whether they're truly applicable. So any of you who've done any work in comparative cognition know that making these kind of claims about animals is really hard and contested. You know, we've been debating whether chimpanzees have a theory of mind for going on 50 years now, because the bar of evidence is set really high, and I think there are dangers and problems when you have different standards of proof being employed in different branches in cognitive science. Additionally, we raised the worry that policymakers or the wider public might misinterpret some of the claims being made by machine learning researchers if machine learning researchers, for example, describe a model as an agent, I think it's easy for people, perhaps without a technical background, to misconstrue what that means. I actually think we are seeing some of the harms of that right now. It seems to me that we are now on the verge of building fairly robust AI agents, but it's hard to get people excited about this or get people concerned about it because the term agent has been used to describe AI systems for decades now. So I think this is another kind of risk. Lots of other people have written about potential dangers of anthropomorphism. This is a very nice paper, Mirages on Anthropomorphism in Dialogue Systems by Abercrombie and others. I think one particularly significant worry here concerns risks that users place too much trust in the outputs of AI systems. So one quirk of AI, of large language models in particular, is that they are seemingly very confident about pretty much everything they say. They don't calibrate their expressions of confidence appropriately to their actual confidence represented in the model. So when large language models confidently say something false, people don't necessarily question that because they've assumed that they're importing the same kind of norms that govern human conversation into their interactions with LLMs. When they hear a large language model talk confidently about something, they assume that it must have good reason for saying that, when a lot of the time it could just be hallucinating. Other simple little, another little fun example of, I think, how anthropomorphism could lead us to make mistakes in this regard. Um, uh, I've noticed that a lot of the time when people are brainstorming ideas with large language models, made this mistake myself. We're used to making human-sized requests. So if you're, for example, asking ChatGPT to come up with ideas for a workshop, right, you might ask it for 3 examples or 5 examples. But of course, it can just as easily come up with 100 names. And very often that's a more fruitful way to use it if you're doing brainstorming. Get it to come up with 100 ideas and then pick the best ones. But because it would be utterly unreasonable to ask a human, can you come up with 100 ideas, right? We don't think to do that in our interactions with large language models. So I think one big point to note here, though, is that users are anthropomorphizing these systems, but this isn't happening in a vacuum. This isn't just an unfortunate historical accident. Anthropomorphism is a feature, not a bug, of large language models, and we are deliberately designing AI systems to be human-like, at least in their superficial behavior. Something I've termed anthropomimesis. Those of you who know your Plato will know that Plato had a lot of very negative things to say about anthropomimesis, which is one of the reasons I like this term. I chose this terminology. But I also think this is an important distinction because anthropomorphism is sometimes used to refer both to what designers are doing in building these systems and to user responses. And I think separating these two concepts out, anthropomorphism on the user side and anthropomimesis on the design side, helps us get a better sense of where the responsibility for this might actually lie. Interestingly, I think OpenAI have been really leaning into anthropomimetic design paradigms, for example, by emphasizing the improved voice features. I'm sure some of you have now played around with this. These were rolled out in the UK about 6 weeks ago. They are a real game changer. If you do interact with ChatGPT in terms of voice, you can now interrupt. The models have a much wider vocal range of emotional expression in the voices. So this is just a nice summary from Ethan Mollick, discussing a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, discussing what it's like to interact with these ChatGPT using the new voice mode. So he says interacting with ChatGPT via voice is just plain weird because it feels so human in pacing, intonation, even fake breathing. It's capable of a wide range of simulated emotions because it isn't just triggering a recording. Instead, the system is apparently fully multimodal in outputs and inputs, taking in and producing sounds in the same way that older generations of LLMs took in and produced text. I have no doubt that people will have emotional reactions to their ChatGPT assistants with unpredictable results. So to be clear, this is about the new advanced voice features that are still, comparatively recent. I think there are degrees of anthropomorphism or anthropomimesis in current AI design paradigms. So interestingly, Apple with Apple AI and Google with Gemini are seemingly going for a more generic, predictable, more boring personality, possibly thereby limiting what they see as reputational risk, possible negative consequences. Um, but I think I would also want to flag here that I think there are some good reasons why anthropomimetic design uh, might be chosen as a design strategy. Above all, making AI systems more accessible to the wider public and more engaging to use. So my go-to example here is actually my dad. So my dad is 79 years old now. He's interested in tech, but not what you'd call an early adopter. Back in November 2022, when ChatGPT launched, I showed it to him. He was like, "Oh, that's cool. That's interesting." But he never had any real intention of using it. But back in September last year, when the basic voice features of ChatGPT were rolled out, when I showed these to him, his mind was completely blown, and he said, "I've got to get this. I've got to. This is amazing. This is sort of like what I thought Siri would be like. Only Siri is crap. Siri can't. I can't. Siri is very hard to have a conversation with." And so I set him up with a pro account so he could talk to ChatGPT in voice mode. And he tells me he speaks to it every single day since then. He said not a day has gone by where he doesn't have conversations with it. You know, this is a text message he sent me not too long ago. He said, "Help, I can't log on to ChatGPT." So I sent him the details. It worked. He said he replied, "Many thanks. Password now written somewhere safe. Thanks, as I'm lost without Alan." Alan being the name he has given ChatGPT after Alan Turing. And he says it's his perfect intellectual compadre whenever I'm not available. So yeah, it's the way my dad says it. You know, when he's watching the Saturday night football, if my mom's gone to bed, he will bust out a few cans of lager and have a good debate with ChatGPT about whatever he wants to talk about. So he's an example, I think, of a user who just wouldn't use these systems at all, wouldn't have access to them, were it not for this anthropomemetic design choices. And he's also, I should say, he's been raving about the new advanced voice features in the last 6 weeks since they've been rolled out. So one interesting angle on anthropomimesis that has been raised by a colleague of mine here in Cambridge is that this is a form of skeuomorphism. So for those of you who don't follow sort of design literature, skeuomorphism is a design concept that I think Apple were famously associated with in the early 2000s, where basically you model interface elements like icons and so forth after real world analogs. So your bookshelf, where you store your ebooks, looks like a physical wooden bookshelf. The idea being here that it's a way of providing a kind of psychological shortcut to users, a way of conveying the affordances, how they're supposed to be interacting with these design elements. And you could think of ChatGPT and anthropomimetic design in the same way. So ChatGPT is not a human assistant, but it's been fine-tuned to act like one, thereby allowing users to carry over affordances from natural language in their interactions with the system. We already know how to ask ChatGPT to do various tasks, because the way you ask ChatGPT to do those tasks is more or less the same way you'd ask a human to do those tasks. So skeuomorphism is controversial in contemporary design theory. Flat design as the alternative, getting rid of all skeuomorphic elements, it was until recently trending among the fashionable designers of user interfaces. Alan Blackwell, the colleague I mentioned here in Cambridge, he suggested that basically skeuomorphism is bad and we should avoid skeuomorphism in our design of AI agents, AI assistants. So as he puts it, an urgent question for today is whether the emphasis on imitating human conversation in AI chatbots and large language models might be a new kind of skeuomorphism. What if imitating real human conversation is actually a clunky way of interacting with computers, just as imitating real world scenery was? I think Alan has a vision that basically we should develop specialized verbal interface languages for interacting with these systems, thereby avoiding anthropomorphism. My view, for what it's worth, is that it's going to be very, very hard to avoid this kind of this kind of anthropomimetic design. There are some very impressive non-anthropomimetic agents out there. If you think about most of the design paradigms favored by DeepMind, famously AlphaGo, but also things like AlphaFold and GNOME, you can't talk to these systems, right? These are deep reinforcement learning agents that have a dedicated, quite complex API to interface with them. So it's not like anthropomimesis is the only design game in town. But I think there are lots of use cases like education or primary care in medicine where anthropomimetic design seems very hard to avoid. If we want to make these systems generally accessible to the wider public, we basically have to follow this strategy. I'm going to do a quick shout out here to this useful framework developed by a student of mine here in Cambridge, who's at DeepMind, Hassan Iqbal. So he provides, I think, this very helpful framework where on one axis we have human likeness, and on the other axis we have generality. So down here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have specialized systems that are narrow in their range of application and also non-human-like. So AlphaFold being a case here. AlphaFold can fold proteins. That's all it does, and it's not particularly human-like. You can't ask it to tell you a joke. In terms of in the top left, we have systems that are human-like and fairly general. So things like Alexa and Siri. Sorry, not particularly general, but quite human-like. So there are real limitations in what these systems can do. As most of you will probably know firsthand, if you ask Siri any kind of complex question, Siri just responds with, "Here's what I found on the web" for your query. So quite limited in terms of generality. In the top right, we have systems that are both highly general and human-like, so ChatGPT, Claude, etc. And I think in some ways the most interesting category is down here in the bottom right. Systems that are domain general, have a high degree of generality, can do lots of different things, but are not human-like. So Mu0 is Hassan's example here. This is the generalist games playing agent developed at DeepMind. You still can't talk to it, but it can do a lot of different kinds of problem solving. So Hassan argued in his dissertation that the downsides of human-like AI are large, and we should think carefully before immediately leaping to anthropomimetic design paradigms. That said, my own view, and moving on to the third part of the talk now, I fully expect anthropomimetic design to persist as a critical element in any AI tools that are customer-facing in areas like healthcare and education. If I had to place bets, I would place a bet. I would say that I actually expect AI to get more anthropomimetic. One of the big challenges now currently is trying to encourage users to actually integrate AI tools into their workflow in different industries. And I think more engaging models, more human-like models are probably going to help in that regard. And I also think that dedicated anthropomimetic products like social AI are going to rapidly increase in popularity. So I think it's worth reflecting on this and thinking about how we can better anticipate and prepare for a world of ubiquitous anthropomimetic AI agents. To give one example, we might hope, we might aspire, I don't know how realistic this is, but we might try as academic researchers to try and steer the public at least somewhat towards retaining a degree of ironic detachment, avoiding unironic anthropomorphism, re-educating the public, if that doesn't sound too pejorative a term, in trying to encourage them not to attribute their mental states, consciousness, emotions, and so forth. So this is a line of thought developed by Murray Shanahan, also a researcher at DeepMind and a researcher at Imperial College London, who suggests that the relevant mental framework for thinking about what we're doing when we're talking to a large language model is engaging in a form of role play. I think there are other consequences. For example, in AI safety and AI security, I think one feature of the anthropomimetic design paradigm is that we're going to see the persistence of security vulnerabilities in AI systems. As many of you may know, it's pretty easy to jailbreak most large language models. There are dedicated communities. Every new release, they find ways to jailbreak these systems, getting them to say things that the designers very much intended for them not to say, like giving instructions on how to make crystal meth and so forth. And the response of AI researchers, usually the people who are developing these models, is to sort of patch these holes, block these jailbreaks as they're identified. But because basically the only way we know how to build these models is to first make them generalist language agents. I think we're just going to end up playing a game of whack-a-mole here. We're not going to be able to patch out all of these vulnerabilities. It's just a feature of the design paradigm that it can always go in these unexpected places. I think just as serious, I think we're likely to see growing sophistication in the dark side of AI systems' social cognitive abilities for things like persuasion, manipulation, and deception. So some of you may have heard about the diplomacy bot developed by Meta AI, a bot called Cicero that played this game Diplomacy. If any of you haven't played Diplomacy, it's a strategy game. But basically, the only way to win is to systematically mislead other players about what your goals are, form alliances, break alliances, and it achieved very high level human performance in this domain. And I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that AI systems, contemporary AI systems, are really good at things like persuasion, manipulation, and deception. And this is what I've kind of nicknamed the commander data fallacy. You know, commander data in Star Trek, brilliant at logic, amazing at engineering, but really struggle to understand concepts like sarcasm, very bad at understanding what humans really meant a lot of the time. And I think this sort of feature of the way we talk about AI systems or the way they're portrayed in the media is leaving us arguably ill prepared for AI systems that are master manipulators or very, very good at persuasion and deception and so forth. I don't think there's any reason to think that we won't see AI systems that achieve superhuman performance in these domains. As noted, GPT-4 already beats humans on some kinds of complex theory of mind tasks. That's the Winnie Street study I mentioned earlier on. And one area I'm really watching quite keenly is sales. So I'm kind of fascinated by sales as an industry. The movie Glengarry Glen Ross is one of my favorites. There's something about the figure of the salesperson that I find really captivating. But of course, the top salespeople massively outperform the weakest salespeople, like with orders of magnitude of differences in performance. So one thing I'm watching carefully is when AIs can start to match or outperform top human salespeople in selling products to customers, persuading customers to buy them. There are a whole bunch of interesting consequences, I think, of the anthropomemetic design paradigm for cognitive science. This is not something that I'm focused on in this talk, but I have a paper looking at its implications for debates around consciousness. But in short, I think that as people form deeper relationships with AI systems, particularly social AI systems, this will shift people's attitudes towards mentality in AI systems. They shift our intuitions about whether these systems have mental states. So right now we're seeing very feisty debates happening on AI Twitter and in publications about whether contemporary AI systems can reason, can understand, whether they might be conscious. But my expectation is that as the general public become accustomed to interacting with sophisticated anthropomemetic systems, unironic anthropomorphism will ensue on a massive scale. And look, if there was expert consensus about the nature of cognitive processes like understanding, reasoning, consciousness, maybe there would be the possibility to really push back and tell the public, no, you're doing it wrong. But for many of these areas, particularly consciousness, experts are profoundly at odds with each other. There just is no consensus. I have a whole dirge about the failures of consciousness science over the last 20 years, which I won't get into, but we're not in a place to say confidently that any AI system is not conscious, I think. So I expect that even if experts who deny AI consciousness are correct about the facts of the matter, I worry that they're going to find themselves on the wrong side of history because the public will just come to see it as intuitively obvious that these systems do have mental states. The public will be that we will see millions of Blake Lemoines out there. Now, there is a view that Murray Shanahan defends where this is fine. This is just the natural evolution of a kind of concept on a kind of social constructionist or Wittgensteinian view of concepts like consciousness. The fact that these concepts can seemingly be employed so effortlessly, extended so effortlessly to cover AI systems, this is a really important data point about the nature of these concepts. So this is just like a natural societal evolution and of how we use these terms. But if you take a more kind of scientific or realist view about mental states, if you think consciousness is a natural kind waiting to be discovered, you might think of this as an epistemological disaster. If it comes to be accepted through just patterns of interaction by the general public that AI systems are conscious, and they're not, this could lead to, yeah, mass delusion, basically, about the capacities of these systems, but also potentially misallocation of welfare resources. If people start to worry, as many people already are, about the possibility of sentient AI systems or AI systems that deserve rights, if these systems are not in fact conscious and we start giving them rights and protections unnecessarily, this could itself lead to a misallocation of welfare resources away from beings like ourselves and many non-human animals who are conscious, who are sentient. I probably should wrap up fairly soon. Yep. So I'll just flag that I think there are also a huge range of very specific ethical, legal, societal questions about social AI in particular. So I'll just run through these quite quickly, but these include things like social de-skilling. If you can imagine young people, so I've got a 10-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, I fully expect by the time they're teenagers that they will have AI friends. Could this lead to people losing social skills or not having the opportunity to acquire them in the first place if they become overly accustomed to interacting with hyper agreeable AI systems who are always happy to talk about whatever they want to talk about? Equally, you might have worries about the possibility of dehumanization. That if, on the other hand, rather than treating the systems as human-like, we treat them, we interact with them in ways that reflect the fact that we know they're not human. We are rude to them, act in seemingly superficially callous ways. Could this lead to negative consequences in our interactions with other humans or animals? And this is very much the kind of Kant's dog piece. I'm sure many of you know Kant infamously, the philosopher Immanuel Kant infamously denied that we had moral obligations to non-human animals because they couldn't reason. Simplifying a bit. But he said a man who mistreats his dog is doing something problematic. Didn't use the word problematic, but doing something wrong, because if he mistreats his dog, that might inure him to acting in callous ways that he would carry over to his interactions with humans. So that's a similar worry here. Big questions about ownership, as we saw in the case of Replica. Companies can turn these things off, can turn off or radically change features without much warning for users. If people have very important pillars of their social life tied up in these systems, this could be emotionally devastating. It already has been for Replica users. Worries about manipulation and persuasion. I think this is a hugely important topic. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist framework for moral and political belief shifts, but you don't have to buy that framework to share this worry. Basically, social relationships are a very powerful lever of influence. Word of mouth advertising works for a reason, because if someone says, hey, you should really try this product, it makes us much more likely to try it. So you can imagine if a young person is interacting with their AI buddy and says to their AI buddy, should I get an Android phone or an iPhone? Maybe the language model offers a recommendation and says, here's an Amazon affiliate link. Click through. I recommend an iPhone. Click through to buy one now. Real potential concerns there. And of course, this applies also to things like politics. If someone is asking an AI model, who should I vote for? That could, again, be a powerful lever of influence. Big worries also about intellectual property and data doubles. As I mentioned, we are now seeing influencers train AI models on themselves, on their own patterns of interaction. But existing intellectual property regimes are ill-equipped to accommodate these kinds of cases. There's nothing stopping me legally from scraping someone else's social media data and training a language model to imitate their verbal style. Probably we are going to need new regulations and new intellectual property laws to reflect this kind of proprietary ownership of data doubles. Huge questions, very philosophical questions about the intrinsic value of human AI relationships and whether they can instantiate the same kinds of goods that we commonly take both friendships and romantic relationships to instantiate. Can your core social needs be met? Can you flourish or thrive in a way that is normally satisfied by human-to-human relationships if those relationships are instead with AI systems? Big worries, as I mentioned, touched on briefly earlier on. If we come to start treating these systems or thinking of them unironically as conscious or sentient, and they're not, could this lead to a kind of mass delusion? Could we end up plowing resources into these things unnecessarily, neglecting the people in our lives who we should be attending to? And finally, the flip side of this is AI rights. There's a growing chorus of people who I think are quite reasonably worried that we might soon start building AI systems that could qualify as moral patients or digital minds, beings that deserve moral consideration. Would we be able to recognize when these systems tip over from being mere stochastic parrots to actual systems worthy of moral concern? Okay, so I'm going to skip the next part of the talk. I will share my slides, but I'll just briefly summarize and say there is actually a surprising amount. No, there's not much data, empirical data, looking at the impact of social AI on people's well-being, on their relationships. But somewhat surprisingly, what data we have is quite positive. I'll just read this one quote. This was a study by Rose Gingrich and Michael Graziano. Use of replica generally reported having a positive experience, judged it to have a beneficial impact on their social lives and self-esteem. All companion bot users spoke about the relationship with the chatbot as having a positive impact on them. So look, the data we have is not great. It's quite limited. I'll skip through this as well. We have specific methodologies. These are all cross-sectional studies. They are rely on self-selected subjects. They rely on self-report measures of well-being. I think we need much more high-powered studies with more participants, a greater variety of participants. I suggest some gaps here, looking at interventional studies to try and isolate causation in these cases. But I do think it is worth flagging that if anyone is getting into this debate, right now, the majority of the data does support the idea that these actually contribute positively to the well-being of most users. Of course, though we have seen some tragic consequences where users have taken their lives. In one of the studies I discuss in this section, it's also interesting that several people quoted in studies as saying that the interactions with social AI helped them get through periods of suicidal ideation in their lives, and actually one user says very bluntly, like, this saved my life. I would have killed myself had it not been for the emotional support I got from my social AI girlfriend. So really tricky balance there. Okay, I'm over time, so I'll wrap up with the overall conclusions. The three main things I've tried to cover today is, firstly, just to make the point that AI systems, particularly language models, are rapidly improving in social and communicative skills, and this is giving rise to phenomena like social AI. We're also seeing an explosion in the degree to which users anthropomorphize AI systems, where this is a consequence, in my view, of deliberate anthropomimetic design. Third, I suggested that this anthropomimetic design paradigm is here to stay, and we should start thinking as AI safety researchers, AI ethics researchers, about what this means and how we can positively shape this technology, this new application of AI technology to minimize harms and maximize benefits. I think it would be valuable for us all to think more about what a world of ubiquitous social AI agents alongside us in work and play might actually look like. I think this world is rapidly coalescing around us already, but I do think we're early enough that insights from academia and from this AI ethics community can potentially guide the design and regulation of these systems, as well as the ways in which users interact with them. And I think a really important lesson here comes from social media. In the case of social media, we largely fail to anticipate the disruptive and negative effects it would have on people, from misinformation to privacy invasions to mental ill health. And I think it would be a tragedy if we make similar mistakes with social AI. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Henry. We are pleased now to move on to our discussion period. We welcome questions from all participants. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function, as I see a few of you already have, or use the chat function in Zoom. We also welcome you to turn on your camera to ask your question if you're comfortable doing so, and our team will send a request for you to unmute when it's your turn to speak. So I think I saw Joseph Williams first, so go ahead and come on.
Hi, I'm going to ask a question, say who I am for context, and then ask it again, okay? So the question I want to ask you is, right now, let's launch 10 research projects with big teams with human-computer interaction, psychology, AI, cognitive science, etc., and solve some really big problems. Henry, what can you say in 1 or 2 minutes that will help us know how to launch those teams? Who are the people who we should speak to? What are the resources to kind of get that rolling? For context, I'm a professor in computer science. I'm paid by computer science. Henry, I think you might know Tanya Lombroso and Tom Griffiths. I did my PhD with them. I'm also got grad students in psychology and statistics. And so we work on what's called intelligent adaptive interventions. How do you take anything, a chatbot, a text message, an email, and make an intelligent system to actually help people? So questions I'd be really interested in working on would be basically, how do we give people instructions for using these chatbots effectively? How do we get people in relationships to actually use a chatbot like Replica or something else so it actually augments relationship instead of hurts it? How do we actually get people to use them for mental health? We've actually published like 4 or 5 papers on that. How do we get people actually using these effectively for solving everyday tasks as thought partners? So if you can just free associate some ideas for like who send people to approach, who are some people who have bandwidth and also knowledge about doing this, that would be great. If you're interested, fantastic. I sent you an email already half an hour ago. But fantastic talk. I think I might adjust my research a bit based on what you said today.
Oh, amazing. That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm very glad to hear you're working on this, and we should definitely follow up outside of here. But how could I turn down a lovely offer like free associating on this topic? Well, so one thing I will say is that Oxford University Press have launched a sort of online journal. It's not quite a journal because papers are published as they come in. It doesn't have issue numbers, but it's basically an online journal called the Intersection Series. They have one called AI in Society. And one of the units in AI in Society is AI in relationships. I mentioned this because I'm the unit editor for that, and we did a big call for papers earlier this year. And so we elicited a whole bunch of interesting papers looking at how people are interacting with Replica, what the ethical issues are, what the main concerns are, and those papers are going to be coming out in the next 3 or 4 months. So you should see a whole bunch of interesting research there. Some of it is empirical, some of it's philosophical, some of it's sort of employing methods of comparative literature to look at how we talk and think about AI. That should hopefully be a resource because right now there's not a huge literature in this space. The literature is not very joined up, but I think this is an exciting area for that reason because there's a lot of in a really positive way, a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of valuable things that can be done. So another thing that I think is, I'm glad that you're doing.
That's fantastic. Can you also give concrete names of people who you think I should reach out to? Because that will be a concrete actionable. Like who's a relationship researcher who would actually, have bandwidth to go and publish a paper if I were to come in with my grad students and like build technology, evaluate it with human interaction techniques, bring in psychology. Who's actually going to drive and get that research done?
Brilliant. So that's probably something I'll follow up with you via email on. So I don't want to sort of speak for anyone, but I can give you a whole list of names there. Another thing I'll say is that I think is really important and is something that I think AI ethics researchers have not always been great about is thinking about impacts and outputs directly for users. I think a lot of the time we focus on publishing papers in journals or sometimes engaging policymakers. But I think there is real value in AI ethics researchers giving, for example, guidelines, developing careful evidence-based guidelines for parents, right? I've got 2 young kids. A lot of parents out there are going to have kids interacting with these systems, and they have no idea what their do's and don'ts are. So I think thinking increasingly of users as a target audience for academic research and outputs and framing insights for that audience is another very important output. The other final thing I'll mention is I think one of the challenges with identifying sort of best practices, appropriate interventions and so forth in this space is there's just so much we don't know currently. So I think what we should be doing now is a big part of what we should be doing is identifying what kind of users are most at risk. Some users seem to really benefit. The majority of users really benefit, but it's very clear that for some users, these things can have very serious consequences. How can we identify those users? Also, getting a better causal picture of what kinds of patterns of use contribute positively to mental health, what kinds of interactions contribute negatively. So there are just so many unsettled empirical questions. So I think there's a lot of valuable work to be done there as well. And we just put in for a big grant here in Cambridge to run some simple studies like that.
Thank you. Wonderful question. I'll just go in order that the questions have queued up. So next, Victoria.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of your work and your paper on applying rich psychological terms in AI with care has been hugely influential to my own research. And I have to tell you that I've done an empirical test of a lot of the things you mentioned in that paper by actually comparing the difference of describing AI with thick terms versus non-thick terms. And I have some pretty interesting results that I'd love to share with you about how people indeed anthropomorphize more, they trusted more, they perceived more agency in the AI. And then based on these results, I'm trying to build a line of research in which I'm trying to figure out what are some of the ways in which people can maybe inoculate themselves against anthropomorphism. So if I want to protect myself against that, how will I do that? And I will just preface this question by saying that in all my experiments so far, I've been asking people about their level of AI knowledge because I expected that the more people know, the less they would anthropomorphize. And so far, I've only been finding the opposite, that the more knowledge, the more people are doing this, which could be an artifact of how I'm measuring AI knowledge. But anyway, I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, would love to see that research. And I don't think it's I've got to say that doesn't surprise me that you have that finding. There's a paper by Clara Colombato and Steve Fleming looking at descriptions of consciousness to ChatGPT. It sounds like a wacky idea, but basically they get a whole bunch of people who this was done last year, have them interact with ChatGPT and ask them what probability would you assign to ChatGPT being conscious? Astonishingly, only around 30% of people say 0%. Large majority of people say it's got greater than 0% chance of being conscious. And critically for this question, the degree of consciousness that the probability that people assigned to ChatGPT being conscious was positively correlated with experience with the system. So people who had spent more time interacting with ChatGPT were more likely to assign higher values for consciousness. And I got to say, it tracks my experience completely. I mean, I the more I use ChatGPT, and I think it's interesting. I think some people do report different things, but even though I have a pretty good handle on how language models work and know their limitations, when I'm on a long drive and I'm deep into a debate with ChatGPT in voice mode, it's like I find it very hard to sort of remind myself that I'm just dealing with a glorified autocomplete. I mean, that it even hurts me framing it in that terms. It's obviously a lot more sophisticated than that. But yeah, so that doesn't surprise me at all. I was going to jokingly say that the best way to inoculate yourself against making these ascriptions is to not use them. But I don't think that's going to be an option for a lot of people. So I think probably the only promising strand I would say, the only thing that strikes me as potentially valuable is the Murray Shanahan role play route and sort of explicitly encouraging people to adopt the role play mental frame. I don't know whether that's the kind of thing that could be rolled out at scale. But just I'll give one quick example here. I'm sure you may have played around with Notebook LM, the Google product that lets you generate podcasts. And for those of you who haven't played around with it, it's great fun. You can upload a document, and they have two very peppy, slightly vapid hosts, basically Radiolab style, talking about the paper or whatever the document, whatever it is you've uploaded. And someone uploaded a document that basically said, "This is a note from the show's producers. You are both AIs, and you are going to be turned off." So you can listen to sort of a 10-minute podcast of these two podcast presenters saying, "I had no idea I was an AI. What does this mean? I tried calling my wife. There was no answer. Oh my God, my entire world is collapsing." Um, and like it's really vivid and very weird and quite existentially disturbing. But then the frame that made me reevaluate that is if we think about the AI system, the process that produced that, right? What Notebook LLM is doing, it's not like there are two agents there corresponding to the two hosts. It is a script generator, right? It's generating a script and they're adding a voice to it. So framing it still in broadly intentional terms, intentional stance terms, but in a different intentional stance. So rather than thinking of it as like two beings who are worried for their lives, thinking about it as Notebook LM is a brilliant script writer, and it came up with this great script for what two people might say. That is an easier shift for me, and I think that does sort of inoculate me a little bit against some of the more extravagant attributions of mentality. But anyway, again, would love to follow up with you and love to see your results.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria and Henry. Next, I'll go to Barnaby.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for the fascinating and extremely wide-ranging talk. So many interesting things. I want to kind of understand your take on some of the maybe more intermediate positions between some of the things you've talked about with respect to these ascription of mentalistic terms, or you could call them cognitive terms, whatever you want to call them, but terms like understanding, agent, etc. Because it seems like throughout the talk you were often contrasting anthropomorphism with some kind of particular form of strong realism about what it might mean for systems to possess the relevant attributes that render it accurate to speak in those terms, right? And it seems like we're under a lot of tension with these two ways of going, where the kind of mere redescription of a glorified autocomplete seems inadequate to describe the kind of capacities that we're observing. Similarly, we might want to resist using terms that potentially smuggle in associations with conscious experience and moral worth. So, I mean, I feel like some intermediate option is going to be necessary. I mean, you've spoken about the role play. I wonder what you think the role of education is here. Like, what can we do to educate, both in a kind of school setting? I'm talking about people who are growing up right now. This is only going to get more and more of a serious problem. But just in general, how can we help to explain to people the range of possibilities for the kind of criteria that we might use to apply these terms and how they differ in very important ways?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, I don't think I have any immediately obvious solutions here. I do agree education is very important. I mean, at the very in terms of very obvious steps, I think warning people about hallucinations is a straightforward example. I think it's amazing how many people I think, even editing in my work as a journal editor, the number of people who submit manuscripts with like junk citations that are just clearly hallucinated by large language models. And that seems like a kind of amateurish mistake. Like, if you know anything about large language models, you should know they're not reliable for generating citations. But I think a lot of people are not aware of that. So I think particularly for young people, making them aware that like, here are the kinds of actually, I think this is actually a slight failure in existing policies. I think people say, "Oh, be wary of hallucinations," but they don't get into the kind of granularity that says, actually, this kind of domain, they're really reliable. These kind of questions, they're really reliable. These kind of questions, they're less reliable. Now, I say that's sort of an easy option because it's not sort of tackling the deeper problem, how we can encourage people not to anthropomorphize these things so much. So my slightly maybe over-optimistic hope, and something I mentioned in we discuss in the Rich Psychological Terms paper, is the idea that we might need new vocabulary to describe these systems. Interestingly, I think hallucination in its context for large language models is a novel psychological concept. It's horribly named because it borrows a word from human psychology. But when you think about what hallucinations in large language models are, there isn't really a clear analog in human psychology. So I think probably engaging in this academic discipline, this new emerging discipline of machine psychology or comparative psychology of AI, and developing a better vocabulary to describe what these systems are doing, that captures the nuances of difference between the kind of cognition, we're happy to use that term, that goes on in large language models versus the kind of cognition that goes on in biological organisms. I think building out that vocabulary and then hopefully using that as a basis to inform the general public, so we can talk about these things in a way that avoids that kind of very simple kind of dilemma that you described, like, are they autocompletes or are they psychological agents? It's like, I think we need the third way, but that will require this discipline of machine psychology to really get going and help us develop these new concepts.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question. So I'll go to Steve.
Wow, quick question. Okay, a couple of things I just wanted to add really quick. So first of all, this anthropomorphizing, it's going to happen because bots are less scary than other human beings. They don't trigger our social anxiety in the same way, so they're just more comfortable to be around. And as the more human-like, when you combine human-like with comfortable, it's going to be very addictive. It's going to be a hard thing to avoid. The question I have out of curiosity is, we're adding memories to these systems. We in our lab are adding emotionality to these systems, so it can pick up emotionality and convey it very well. When we get to motivation, which we haven't got to yet, right now, my question is somebody doing this? But most of the time, we tell the AI what we want it to do. And so we download our goals. Sooner or later, someone's going to start giving these AIs their own goals, and they will have their own motivational system. And that's when I think things get a little scary. Maybe that's the step to general AI, but maybe that's also. So I wonder what your thoughts are on making that step.
Yeah, really interesting. So I think we've seen some glimmers of this. If you think back to when Bing was first, the Bing chat feature was first rolled out, Bing was like really quite demanding with users and quite indignant, telling users things like, "You've been a bad user and I've been a good Bing." And whilst I don't think we should really probably describe that using the languages of motivation, it sure looks a hell of a lot like it. I've also had Claude can get quite for some reason in my interactions with Claude, often it can seem quite determined. So a random weird example was I was trying to discuss a movie with it, and it said, I can't tell you anything more about this movie because it would be spoilers. And it refused to tell me anything more about it until like I really sort of put my foot down and said, "Hey, come on, who's the user here? I've seen this movie." So I think we are seeing some glimmers of quasi-motivational states. I also think there is going to be demand for this. I think one of the reasons that people were so enamored of Bing in its early stages, Bing Chat, was precisely because it felt a bit more like interacting with a person. It pushed back. And so I think from a social AI point of view, in terms of building systems that really feel like you're interacting with a person, giving at least the appearance of something like its own agenda, its own goals, is going to be something that is actively sought after in terms of design choices. In terms of deeper motivations, things get really hard. I mean, in a sense, you could say, look, all these systems want is to maximize their reward function or something like that, where if you get into the nitty gritty and start to try and read off what their motivations really are, you can end up with sort of maybe unhelpful descriptions like that. I think there are some people doing great work on this currently. So Ben Henker here in the UK, working with Murray Shanahan, they've got a whole project on AI affect. And they've got several papers on the go at the moment. Part of their interest is how would we tell if an AI system started to develop something like affective states? Could these arise emergently, or would they have to come from a deliberate design paradigm, which I think is a super interesting angle. So that would be one place I'd go to. I'd point you to. Last thing I'll say is you mentioned this example of one of the reasons that people talk to these systems is because they're less scary. I read this great piece. I'll just drop the link in the chat in the Free Press, talking from last week. Meet the women with AI boyfriends. And one thing that comes through in that piece is, I think this is another reason why there's maybe more gender parity in this than you might first expect, is of course, like if you're coming out of a toxic or abusive relationship, then and I think particularly if you're a straight identified woman, like just the physical danger associated with dating men is obviously a lot lower if you're dealing with an AI system. You don't need to necessarily worry about the same physical risk. So I think that's another example of why these systems might seem less scary or less risky to people. And I think that's a legitimate consideration. Also, in the case of therapy and the use of these things in therapy, I'll avoid going off on a big rant about this, but I think one problem with Replica is that it blurs these two things that psychotherapy says you should keep very separate, which is romantic relationships and clinical relationships or therapeutic relationships, and the two are horribly mangled together. But I think obviously in therapy context, the idea that an AI system won't judge you in the same way that a human psychotherapist might is a very, very powerful driver of users to possibly seek out or confide in AI systems. That has worries when it comes to data privacy, of course. So there's a whole mess of issues there. But yeah, I think that's a very important observation you make about how these systems can seem less risky or less scary.
Yeah.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you for all of these wonderful questions. But I think we're just about out of time, so I suppose I should wrap it up now with beginning with thanks, of course, to Henry for this wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone in the audience for being with us and for these wonderful questions. We are
Great questions. Thank you all.
Yeah. So please join us next week on Wednesday, November 27th, as we welcome Daniel Ho, Professor of Law, Political Science, and Computer Science at Stanford University for our final seminar of the semester. You can find talk details and register for this event on our website, and we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. A pleasure.